On the night of February 28, 2026, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, one of the most sophisticated warships ever built, opened fire in the Persian Gulf. The target was a Shahed 136 drone. The drone cost somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. The missile that killed it cost $4 million, and when the next drone came, another $4 million interceptor went up to meet it, and then another, and another. That exchange ratio, one drone, one missile, 80 to 200 times the cost, repeated itself thousands of times across the Gulf in the weeks that followed. It repeated itself over the UAE, which by March 16th had engaged over 1,600 Iranian drones with its own interceptors. It repeated itself over Qatar, over Bahrain, over Saudi Arabia, over the approaches to every base where American personnel were stationed. It repeated itself until defense analysts started using a phrase you will not hear in Pentagon press conferences, but that you will find in every serious assessment of this conflict: magazine exhaustion, the slow arithmetic bleeding out of the interceptor stockpiles that protect the entire American position in the Middle East. That is what escalated instantly, not the intercept. The intercept was a success. The intercept is always a success. The question nobody is asking loudly enough is, how many successes can you afford? This story has 3 layers. The first is what happened: the tactical picture, the geometry of the drone threat, the specific role the Arleigh Burke destroyers played, and what their missiles were actually designed to kill. The second layer is what it means strategically. How Iran built a weapon that doesn't need to win any individual engagement to win the war of attrition. It is actually fighting. And the third layer is the one that changes everything about the next conflict. Not just this one, because what Iran has demonstrated in the Persian Gulf is now being studied in Beijing and Moscow with an intensity that should make every naval planner in the Western world extremely uncomfortable. Stay with me, because by the time this is over, you are going to understand why the most consequential part of every drone intercept over the Persian Gulf was not the explosion. It was the receipt. Let us start with the weapon itself, because the Shahed 136 is not what most people picture when they hear the word drone. It is not a small surveillance quadcopter. It is a one-way attack loitering munition. A flying bomb, essentially, shaped like a delta wing, powered by a small piston engine, carrying a warhead of between 40 and 50 kilograms, and navigating by GPS and inertial guidance to a pre-programmed target. Its range exceeds 2,000 kilometers. Its cruise altitude is low, sometimes only a few dozen meters above the surface, which puts it below the effective engagement envelope of systems designed to intercept ballistic missiles arcing down from high altitude. It is slow by aircraft standards, it is loud, and it is extraordinarily cheap. That combination of attributes, low, slow, cheap, and numerous, is not an accident. It is a design philosophy. Iran has spent years studying how the United States defends things. It knows that the Aegis combat system on Arleigh Burke destroyers was engineered primarily to defeat Soviet cruise missiles and ballistic missiles on specific engagement geometries. It knows that the standard missile series, the SM-2, the SM-6, the ESSM, are precision interceptors built for high-probability kills against high-value threats, and that they cost between $1 million and $4 million per round. It knows that Patriot batteries, the backbone of ground-based missile defense across the Gulf, fire interceptors costing $4 million each. And it knows that the vertical launch cells on an Arleigh Burke destroyer hold between 96 and 112 missiles total, missiles that cover every mission the ship performs, from land strike to anti-submarine warfare to theater ballistic missile defense. Now send in enough $20,000 drones. The math does not require Iran to destroy a destroyer. It requires Iran to make the destroyer shoot. Every SM-2 expended against a Shahed is one less SM-2 available for the anti-ship cruise missile that follows the Shahed swarm, or for the ballistic missile that arrives in the next barrage. Every Patriot interceptor fired against a low-altitude drone is one less Patriot available for the scenario the battery was procured to address. The magazine drains. The factory that refills it cannot keep pace. and the adversary, operating on cost curves roughly 100 to 200 times cheaper per engagement, can sustain the pressure far longer than the defender can sustain the response. And here is what the mainstream coverage keeps glossing over. In just the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury, the United States fired approximately 170 Tomahawk cruise missiles. That single data point, published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is staggering when you understand its context. The Pentagon had requested from Raytheon enough Tomahawks for the entire 2026 fiscal year, and American forces expended roughly 3 times that number in the first 4 days of the war. Tomahawks cost approximately $1.5 to $2 million each. The arithmetic is not complicated. What is complicated is replenishing that inventory, because the defense industrial base cannot produce Tomahawks at anything close to the rate they were consumed. This is the structural problem that the drone Intercept reveals in miniature. Sources familiar with the intelligence picture suggest that Trump administration officials, in closed-door briefings to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, acknowledge something the public statements carefully avoid. U.S. air defenses will not be able to intercept all of Iran's one-way attack drones. Not some, not many, not most. All. The admission was that the math makes perfect interception impossible at the scale Iran is operating. For every drone factory struck, another one is dispersed into a smaller facility somewhere else. The Shahed requires no dedicated launch infrastructure, no transporter erector launcher, no fixed pad, no hardened facility. It launches from an angled rail on a pickup truck, and the crew drives away. The asymmetry is not just financial, it is architectural. The offense is inherently simpler, cheaper, and more dispersible than the defense it is designed to exhaust. Read that again. The system designed to drain the American defense posture is more resilient than the posture it is draining. Now, let us talk about the mechanism, because the specific geometry of the destroyer Intercept is the part that reveals how this threat works at the tactical level. An Arleigh Burke in the Persian Gulf is doing multiple jobs simultaneously. It is a strike platform, launching Tomahawks at targets inside Iran. It is an Aegis ballistic missile defense node, tracking and engaging Iranian ballistic missiles fired at Allied bases and carriers. It is a surface combatant, positioned to engage Iranian fast attack craft and patrol boats harassing shipping near the Strait of Hormuz. And it is a drone interceptor, engaging Shahids before they can reach the carrier strike group or assets ashore. Every one of those missions draws from the same vertical launch system, the same finite magazine. A ballistic missile track is detected early. Radar picks it up on the upswing, trajectory is computed, intercept solution is generated, SM-3 or SM-6 goes up. Clean engagement geometry, high probability of kill. The Shahed, by contrast, crosses the radar horizon late. It is flying low enough that terrain and sea clutter mask it until it is relatively close. The engagement window is compressed. The radar picture may be cluttered with multiple contacts arriving from different vectors. The CSIS analysis of the first week of Iran's drone campaign found that 1,422 detected drones and 246 missiles were directed at the UAE alone between March 1st and March 8th. Over 1,600 strikes in 8 days against a single country. Not a single carrier. Not a single base. A single country that also had to defend itself. Scale that across every defended location simultaneously, and the saturation picture becomes clear. What we are hearing from people close to the situation is that the specific intercept pattern used by destroyers in the early days of the conflict, expending standard missiles against Shahed 136s, generated urgent internal concern at CENTCOM about long-term magazine sustainability. The decision to accelerate development and deployment of the Lucas system, the low-cost unmanned combat attack system, which is essentially an American reverse-engineered copy of the Shahed 136 itself, was partly a response to this concern. You cannot out-Shahed Iran with $4 million interceptors. You can only out-Shahed Iran with cheaper Shahids. CENTCOM confirmed the Lucas system in combat during Operation Epic Fury with a statement that deserves to be read carefully. These low-cost drones, modeled after Iran's Shahed drones, are now delivering American-made retribution. The United States military, the most sophisticated conventional force in human history, reached the conclusion that the most effective response to a $20,000 Iranian drone was to build its own $20,000 Iranian drone. Let that land. Because that is the irony at the center of this story, and it cascades outward in ways that go well beyond the Persian Gulf. Here's the first consequence that nobody in the coverage is drawing clearly. The magazine exhaustion problem is not a Persian Gulf problem. It is a China problem. Every Patriot interceptor, every SM-6, every Arrow 3, every THAAD round consumed defending against Iranian Shaheds is a round that does not exist in the inventories the United States has configured to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Defense analysts have been saying this explicitly and loudly. The Washington Monthly described it as tantamount to unilateral disarmament vis-a-vis China. Not metaphorical disarmament, actual reduction in the physical stockpiles that underpin the deterrent. The same interceptors, the same production lines, the same finite industrial capacity. 2 theaters, 1 magazine. The second consequence is structural and strategic. The Shahed 136 has already been deployed by Russia against Ukraine, where Moscow has fired more than 54,000 of them since 2022. Ukraine, massively outgunned and facing the same cost exchange problem the US is facing now, developed a response. Cheap interceptor drones, industrialized, mass-produced, costing a few $1,000s each, designed to physically ram and destroy incoming Shaheds before they reach their targets. More than 200 Ukrainian specialists arrived at U.S. bases in the Gulf during Operation Epic Fury to advise American forces on countering the weapon system that Ukraine had been fighting for years. Let that image settle for a moment. The United States military, with a defense budget exceeding $900 billion per year, required advisors from a country fighting for its survival to teach it how to defend against a drone that costs less than a used car. The third consequence, and this is the one that, according to signals that have not been officially confirmed, is generating the most urgent concern inside the Pentagon, is what Iran has now demonstrated to every state and non-state actor watching. The lesson of the drone campaign in the Persian Gulf is not that Iran was defeated. The lesson is that a country with a fraction of America's military budget was able to force the most powerful navy on Earth to burn through its interceptor stockpiles at an unsustainable rate, force the deployment of Ukrainian drone advisors to American bases, force the emergency development and combat debut of a reverse-engineered copy of the attacker's own weapon, destroy radar systems worth billions of dollars using drones costing tens of thousands, and sustain a tempo of attacks measured in the thousands for weeks. All of that happened. All of it is in the record. The question nobody wants to answer on the record is, if Iran, a sanctioned, isolated, domestically strained regional power, could impose that cost exchange on the United States Navy, what does the same calculus look like when the adversary is China, with a defense industrial base orders of magnitude larger, producing drones and missiles at industrial scale, with no sanctions constraining its supply chains? And here is where the full irony closes the loop. Iran designed the Shahed to solve the problem of confronting a superior conventional force without matching it conventionally. The drone was the asymmetric answer to the carrier, the destroyer, the Patriot battery. It was Iran's way of saying, we cannot build what you built, so we will build something you cannot afford to defend against. And it worked. Not because the Shahed destroyed the U.S. Navy. It did not. The destroyers killed thousands of them. The intercept percentage was high, but the receipt was the weapon. Every intercept generated a cost that accumulated into a strategic liability. The success of the defense became the vulnerability of the defense. The United States, in building the most sophisticated and expensive air defense architecture in history, created an adversary with every incentive to build the cheapest possible weapon to drain it. Iran did exactly that, and in doing so, demonstrated a template that its weapons-sharing partners, Russia and Ukraine, the Houthis in the Red Sea, and now any state watching the Persian Gulf with calculation, have already copied, refined, and will deploy again. There is no version of the next decade in which this dynamic resolves itself without a fundamental restructuring of how the United States and its allies think about magazine depth, interceptor cost curves, and the relationship between industrial capacity and deterrence. The destroyers intercepted the drones. That is true and it matters. But the situation escalated instantly, not because of what the drones hit, but because of what the intercepts cost. And that cost is still being counted. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Here's the question I want you to sit with. If the math of drone attrition favors the attacker by a ratio of 100 to 200 to 1, and the adversary can produce drones faster than the defender can produce interceptors, is there a version of this problem that the United States can solve with the industrial base it currently has? Or does something have to change fundamentally before the next conflict begins? We read every single one. We will see you in the next one. But let us back up and make sure we have the full operational picture before we get to the strategic consequences, because the specific weapons involved matter. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer is the backbone of the United States Navy's surface fleet. 93 of them are currently in service. Each one displaces roughly 9,000 tons and carries an Aegis combat system, an integrated network of radar, computers, and weapons that was originally designed in the Cold War to defend carrier strike groups against Soviet missile saturation attacks. The ship's vertical launch system carries between 96 and 112 cells. Those cells are loaded with a mix of SM-2 and SM-6 standard missiles for air defense, SM-3 interceptors for ballistic missile defense, Tomahawk cruise missiles for land strike, and ESSM quad-packed rounds for short-range point defense. Every weapon in every cell serves a different role, and when a cell fires, it does not reload at sea. That is the fundamental constraint that Iran has been exploiting since it first began studying American naval operations in the Red Sea, where Houthi-launched Shaheds drew down destroyer magazines for months before Operation Epic Fury began. The Navy learned from the Red Sea. It incorporated those lessons, as naval analysts confirmed in the early days of the war. But incorporating lessons does not replenish expended interceptors. It does not compress the production timelines at Raytheon and Lockheed that govern how quickly the cells can be refilled. Learning and resupply are two different problems, and only the first one happens quickly. Here is the number that put the magazine problem into sharpest relief for the analysts who were watching. During the first days of the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea in 2023 and 2024, U.S. Navy ships fired roughly 100 SM-2 and SM-6 standard missiles to intercept drone attacks. 100 intercepts over months. In the Persian Gulf in 2026, Iran launched attacks measured in the thousands, sustained over weeks. The scale is not comparable. The inventory pressure is not comparable. And the production base, still the same factories, still the same supply chains, still the same congressional appropriation cycle, is still built around a world in which 100 intercepts over several months was an exceptionally high operational tempo. What we are hearing from people close to the situation is that the pace of interceptor expenditure in Operation Epic Fury has forced emergency conversations about prioritization that the defense acquisition system was not designed to have in real time. Which platforms get resupplied first? Which theaters get priority when stockpiles are insufficient for simultaneous demands? Whether certain categories of engagement, Shaheds against non-critical targets, can be deprioritized in favor of conserving interceptors for higher-end threats. These are the conversations that happen when a $20,000 drone successfully imposes a $4 million decision on the defender. At scale, faster than the industrial base can respond. The scenario that keeps naval planners awake at night is not the drone that gets through. It is the next conflict, starting before the magazines are full. And here is where the European dimension enters the picture in a way that has not received enough attention. The Bruegel Institute, one of Europe's premier economic think tanks, published an analysis of the drone cost exchange in the Iran conflict and its implications for NATO. The conclusion was direct. Any wider conflict between Europe and Russia can be expected to play out as a more intense version of the conflict in the Middle East, with large salvos of Russian drones and missiles saturating and eventually overwhelming European air defenses. Not possibly, can be expected. The analytical consensus from the institutions watching this most closely is that the asymmetry demonstrated in the Persian Gulf is not an Iranian innovation. It is a feature of modern warfare that any adversary with access to cheap manufacturing and GPS-guided munitions can exploit against any defender whose interceptor costs exceed the attacker's launch costs by a factor of 100 or more. Russia has been running this playbook in Ukraine with Iranian-supplied Shaheds since 2022. It has fired more than 54,000 of them. Ukraine adapted faster than anyone expected, industrializing cheap interceptor drone production, deploying acoustic arrays and mobile radar to feed intercept vectors, building a counter-UAS ecosystem out of necessity that the largest military budgets in the world had not yet developed by design. More than 200 Ukrainian specialists were advising American forces in the Gulf on precisely this problem. Ukrainian companies were already in negotiations with UAE and Qatari defense ministries to supply their interceptor drone systems. The world's most combat-experienced counter-drone force is Ukrainian. The country that has been fighting for its survival against Shahed saturation attacks for 3 years knows more about stopping them cheaply than any other military on Earth. And the United States, arriving late to this problem, is now in the position of student. That is not an indictment. It is a description of where the learning happened fastest and where the institutional knowledge now resides. The U.S. military's response, the Lucas system, the reverse-engineered Shahed, flying American retribution against Iranian targets, is real and it matters as an offensive capability. As a defensive solution, it addresses a different problem. What the destroyer intercept exposed is the defensive cost equation. Lucas solves the offensive cost equation. Both matter, but they are not the same problem, and the defensive one is still open. According to signals that have not been officially confirmed, the Pentagon has been running emergency assessments of magazine sustainability across the full spectrum of contingencies since the early weeks of Operation Epic Fury. Those assessments are asking a question that does not appear in any public statement. If a conflict in the Pacific begins before the Persian Gulf stockpiles are reconstituted, which commitments can the United States actually honor simultaneously? That question does not have a comfortable answer in the current procurement environment, and it is the reason that every intercept over the Persian Gulf, successful, professional, operationally sound, generated escalation not in the tactical sense but in the strategic sense. Each one was a small withdrawal from an account that the depositor cannot refill fast enough. Iran's drones are slow. They are loud, they can be killed, and killing them is emptying the magazine that the next war depends on.